Let's take a look at SSD speed from a practical standpoint to help alleviate any anxiety some of us may have about all the conversation regarding the SSD speed inside the M2 Pro and M2 Max generation computer. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. If you have been following the channel, thank you. If you're new, welcome. Please consider subscribing because that will definitely help me out. And if you find what I'm sharing with you useful, please consider supporting the channel either through the tip jar or YouTube Super Thanks. All the funding will help me directly run the channel and also go into a saving fund to purchase future machine to test on this channel. And with that in mind, let's talk about SSD speed. Does it matter? And if so, when and where does it matter? And if we take an approach from a practical standpoint, should we even care about this? So I made so many videos talking about SSD speed already. I'll leave links to these videos in the description below so you can definitely check them out. And a lot of these are going to take a much more practical approach rather than just complaining about SSD speed. What I'm really showing you is there's really not that much of a variation that you're going to see on a daily basis, and it's definitely not something to worry about. So I'm also going to ask this as well, that if you agree with me, that's fantastic. If you don't, that's perfectly okay too, but please keep your comment kind and cordial. I've been on the receiving end talking about SSD before where you don't necessarily agree, but I get attacked for this. So just remember that there's another human being on the other end of the screen that you're watching right now. And if you don't want to be treated that way, you shouldn't be treating other people that way. So please be courteous, be respectful in the comments. I would greatly appreciate that. Now, here's the thing. Many of us has become super anxious over SSD speed. I hear this all the time in the comments like, oh no, I configure it this way. Now I'm afraid I'm going to run into a problem or anything like that. Here's the case. You're probably not going to run into a problem. And if you are, the variation is so minute that you're not even going to notice it as much. All right. So here are our test system that we have. I have pretty much the variety of the M2 Pro, M2 Max, also the M1 Pro, M1 Max in some configuration, and also the M1 Ultra for us to take a look at. When we look at the SSD speed, we can clearly see that on the 512GB model, yes, it is running slower, but just think about this too, that relatively speaking, compared to anything else, this is still around 3GB per second. I mean, this by any means is still a really fast SSD. Now, the other thing to note as well is that I'll be taking a pro photographer and also light video workflow approach to all these things, but this is something that I do on a daily basis. I photograph weddings, events, I also do architecture, so I deal with large files in large quantity. I have to get them out quick. And now let's jump in and talk about the SSD. So the first thing we have to realize is that the SSD inside our machine, the capacity we have is not finite. Yes, internally you can't expand them anymore once you configure them, but this is the one component in the machine that you can always expand with an external device. Hard drive, SSD, a NAS, or even a DAS you can link up to the system, and there's other ways that you can always expand the storage inside the machine as well. It may not be as convenient as an internal built-in storage, however, you're not just limited to what is built into the machine. Now we have to remember that these are modern SSD that, you know, everything is relative, and by modern standard, I mean, these are still really fast SSD, especially when you really think about if you're getting a machine a stock configuration, they're still more than capable of doing majority of the tasks that you really wanted to do. The other thing I also want to share with you too is that context matter, and we have a tendency to look at SSD speed comparison just going back one generation, which is, you know, maybe just a year or two. But if we look back not too far into, for example, the Intel Max, we can clearly see that, I mean, they're not really running that much faster. In fact, they're just coming up. They're just teetering the 3GB per second in the lower capacity, the 512GB models of today. This is the Mac Pro Xenon. This is with a 2TB SSD. This is the one that I used to own. And this is the machine that Apple still sells today. Interestingly enough, right? There's a 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro, 2015. You can see the speed right there. They're running just at about the same, around 2.5GB per second. Again, those are really fast, but we never really talk about those generation with regards to SSD speed. And here's the other thing to just think about too. This is the Mac Mini M1 with 1TB. It's running at close to 3GB per second as well. So with the 1TB there and the 512, you're looking at about close to the same speed as the M2 Pro, M2 Max. All right, so these are the current generation speed again, just putting it up here to remind us where we are at and how far we have come. And relatively speaking, what we have today is a little bit better than what we have from the Intel generation and is more than enough for what we really need. So now let's take a look at SSD from the following perspective. Number one, bandwidth saturation and also transfer speed. And both of these goes hand in hand. So the first thing is, why do you want to get a faster SSD? Some have argued that this is really for transfer speed. Well, the main question I have to ask you then is, do you have capable devices, either the one that you're copying file from to your Mac or copying the file out from your Mac to an external device? Are those devices that you own right now capable of saturating the higher bandwidth that's available? Because let me simply put it this way. There are expensive SSDs, and these are one of them. These are the Thunderbolt variety that has like the read-write speed up to around 2800 megabytes per second. That's true. But here's the thing, unless you own one of these expensive devices, it will be very difficult for you to really saturate the bandwidth on these 3.5 gigabytes per second or 3 gigabytes per second 512 gigabyte SSD. The other thing we have to think about as well is that because of the capacity itself, you're going to fill this drive up in no time. Another thing to remember practically as well is the type of file you're transferring. If you have this 1 or 2 large movie files, it's definitely going to transfer faster. If you're transferring images, either RAW or JPEG, they're going to be much slower because they are much smaller files broken down into various chunks. Now, if you ever tried to transfer a Lightroom catalog, the transfer speed, it doesn't matter how fast of a drive you have, will drop down quite significantly. And the reason why is because inside the LR Preview or Lightroom Preview, even though you may see one files, there are so many different subfolders with so many little JPEG previews inside there that just really slows down the transfer speed by quite a bit. So when we're looking at transfer speed, really think about the type of files that you have as well, because that's going to play a role. Now, we really take approach of this from a creative standpoint. Where are most of our files originating from? Memory cards, from our cameras. But if we really think about the cameras that we have and the type of memory cards that's out there, for example, we have a CF Express that's around 560, no more faster than a normal SSD. And this doesn't even come to anywhere near the theoretical max transfer speed for even the 512 gigabyte SSD inside M2 Pro and Max. Now, let's say you work with CF Express Type A. On this one, you have a read and write speed that's fairly high, a read speed of around 1700 megabytes per second. The reality of it is, if you just transfer compressed RAW files from the camera, you're never going to reach that number. If you transfer videos, you may be able to. But let's assume for just a moment that you're able to really saturate that bandwidth and everything works perfectly. You're going to need at least 2 of these cards in order for you to really get to that theoretical max of the transfer speed on the 512 gigabyte machine. This is a lot of data you're really transferring. You need to transfer both at the same time. Now let's be a little bit more practical. Let's go with CF Express Type A, which is that one. Most of the time, the read speed is around 800 megabytes per second. You're going to need at least 4 of these to come close to saturating the full bandwidth on the 512 gigabyte SSD. And considering the size of the cards that we have now, you're going to fill up the 512 gigabyte SSD in no time. Another thing to remember as well is that we're just assuming that you're going to get the theoretical max. The reality is that you're not going to get that. So you probably need 5 or 6 cards to transfer, and that is a lot of data. And if you're already shooting that much, my recommendation is to really just upgrade the SSD internally to start with, because that will take you a much longer way and give you more storage space and also room, especially if you're on the job. Now, practically speaking, there are many cameras that we're still using today that uses these old type of media. For example, SD card, 300 megabytes per second. Those get really pricey as well. So most of the time, what do? We can get away with a 170 just fine, so we end up using that. This does not come anywhere near the theoretical max of the 512 gigabyte SSD speed. That's around 3 gigabytes per second right now. Now, if you really want to get a practical perspective, this is pretty much as practical as it's going to get. Another type of SSD that we have are NVMe SSDs, and you can certainly put these into an external enclosure. Most of the time though, even though they can read and write fairly fast, we run into the limitation of a Thunderbolt connection that's built into the enclosure itself. So yes, you're going to get a theoretical max that comes close to that 512 gigabyte SSD. But the thing is this, if you only have 512 internally and the external ones are faster, you're really going to saturate the bandwidth either in or out of that in no time. And the other thing too is that you're going to fill that drive up in pretty much no time at all. So looking at this from a practical standpoint, I can understand that, but I mean, it doesn't really change the argument much. What about SSD speed from the perspective of swapping? Because obviously when the memory gets full, the system has to swap. When swap happens, things start to slow down. But here's the thing, unless you're really doing an intense swap session, you're really not going to notice that much of a slowdown in speed. And if you do, it's fairly going to be minor at the very most. Now, the reason why I advocate that anyone who wants to get the most out of their machine really upgrade the memory first is the following. There is a huge difference between memory bandwidth and SSD speed. So what I'm going to do here is use SSD that can run at around 7 gigabytes per second. These are the 1-2 terabytes or even like above that can run extremely fast. Imagine this for a second. The 512 gigabyte SSD we're referring to can run at around 3 gigabytes per second. So this means that whatever the factor I'm sharing with you right now will almost double. But let's take a look at the fast one for the time being. And for the sake of this conversation, on the M2, you're looking at one that can run internally on the memory sharing between the CPU and GPU. That's 14 times faster, close to 30 times faster on the M2 Pro, and close to 60 times faster on the M2 Max. Now, if you really slower the SSD down to half of this, you're really talking about factors that are almost going to double this easily. So those are the things to think about. And if you want to get the most bang out of your buck, upgrade the memory first. Now, people always tell me that as SSD fill up, it does slow down, and that's absolutely true, and I'm fully aware of that. The thing is this, it has less room, have less free bit to move things around, and that's why things tend to slow down. There's other reasons too, but this is just a gross oversimplification of it. Now, here's the thing. If you're going to fill up a 512 gigabyte SSD and you know that's going to be your intention and you're going to use that much, you're probably better off upgrading to a 1 terabyte SSD so you have more room. But if we take a look at this is now a practical approach from a capacity standpoint, not from an SSD speed standpoint, right? We're looking at the capacity we're going to use, and we're going to the next one up because we know we're going to fill the lower capacity, right? There's also the perspective of multitasking and using the SSD when the swap happens and you're doing multitasking, things are going to start to slow down. And yes, that's absolutely true. But let me also talk about things this way too, and I'm going to pull an excerpt from this video that's also in the description below, which is the test that I've done on the M2 machine comparing, for example, the slower 256 gigabyte SSD to the slightly faster 512 gigabyte SSD one. So for this, I'm going to show you a performance of the machine from a single task and also a moderate multitasking. So 2 browsers open, Chrome, Safari. Each browser have 7 tabs, 4 static web page, 1 YouTube video. Both of these browsers are consuming around 3 to 5 gigabytes. It fluctuates because of video playing and everything. But if we take a look at this data now, we can see something interesting happen. So this is the machine allowing just to run in solo mode. This is the machine running in moderate, and just moderate, by the way, multitasking workflow. This is Lightroom export, which uses both CPU and GPU. And yes, even though this is showing it on a much slower machine, the data can literally be extrapolated and the information is still absolutely valid. Look at the timing. For example, the 16 gigabyte 256 with the slower SSD is still running a lot faster. So that's the first thing. Secondly, when we run it in a moderate workflow, the time almost double, or in a moderate multitasking. Now, there's something to be said about this, that when the computer is really processing things hard, it maximizes the CPU, the GPU on the system. Anything that you do, it's going to slow down significantly anyway, so you can certainly choose to multitask, but you're going to get affected by it. And I always hear the argument that people say like, oh, I want to watch videos while the computer's doing this. Like, let me simply put it this way, and this is a little bit more logical, is that most of us have these smartphones now. Some of us even have tablets. Why don't we entertain ourselves on these devices or do whatever we need to do for the time being on these devices so that we give the computer the resources, all that it needs to do so it can finish the task that much faster. Just notice all these charts. They're almost double the amount of time that would take for just the computer to just run and finish that singular task rather than throwing a lot of tasks at it. And this is a logical approach that I'll be taking and also sharing with you. All right. With that being said, if you really want to know how fast of an SSD you need to use in a daily workflow, running Lightroom, doing edit in Final Cut Pro, well, I have a video made for that. And the TLDR version of it is that any drive that can read and write at around 500 megabytes per second, for example, Samsung T5 would do the job just fine. The only benefit you get from a faster SSD is that the transfer time from copying the files to the computer or copying files out may be a little bit faster. But remember though that the media on each end of those are going to be the cap or the limitation for speed more so than just the computer. All right, taking an approach from the precedence and expectation, I know that Apple have done this with the M1 machine. They put a super fast SSD in there, so we're all expecting everything to run at the same point. Again, this makes sense, and we feel in some way that they're still charging a premium and we may be cheated. But again, if you really take a look at it from the usage standpoint and the variation, it's extremely small. So one way how we're going to approach this, and my recommendation, is for us to rethink SSD a little bit. Instead of just looking at SSD from a capacity standpoint, also think about SSD as a capacity and speed correlation. So the smaller capacity SSD are generally going to have slightly slower speed compared to the larger SSD, which more of them can be run and they can be configured a little bit differently. For example, RAID 1, whatever that may be, internally on the Mac system itself. This is sometimes what we also see in the real world as well with NVMe's, but if we start to think about SSDs in this type of correlation, it gives us a better understanding of why sometimes the speed may be slightly slower, but it doesn't really affect things much. All right, RAM. This is a component that I recommend most people upgrade because it's the one component that you can't really upgrade in the machine. There's no way to expand the RAM. You can't plug in an external RAM in the system, so whatever you have is whatever you got. And the only way to upgrade the RAM, realistically, is to buy a new machine. This is why I want us to really think about this carefully. Think about if you're working with this in one singular computer or these are two computers. A desktop one can have more RAM, can be the most powerful one if you have the Ultra. The one that you take on the road, the laptop, can have less RAM and you're going to be okay. But if this is going to be your one machine and you multitask and you're crazy like me, you have too many browser tabs open, too many browsers and app running at the same time, then I would definitely just configure your system with more RAM than what you think you're going to need in the first place. This way you give the apps, you give the resources necessary to the application to run as efficiently as possible. The best way that I always tell people to do to monitor RAM usage is just see how much you have now. Restart the computer, go into Activity Monitor, Memory tab, and just take a look at memory pressure. If you're green, the number you have right now should be okay. If you're yellow or red, you may want to configure your next machine with more memory. If you want to keep a better track of your memory pressure and usage in general, I recommend iSnap Menu 6. I'm not affiliated with them, but I'll leave links to their website in the description below. And this is a program that I have been using for years to keep track of my usage and also monitor the analytics on my computer. Now for Pro, I generally recommend that you go with 32 gigabytes of memory because that's going to take you a much longer way. If you don't use that now, but should you need it in the future, you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of benefit that comes from it. And this is a quick guide on how you read the specs for the machine that I'll be doing the test on. For this, we're going to take a look at Lightroom Classic. You're going to see this result before if you've watched my other videos, but we're going to take a look at this from the SSD speed perspective only. As a reminder, the 512 gigabyte SSD, these are the two that runs on half the speed of the higher capacity one. And with this generation, the 512 is also running slower as well. So let's take a look at this. From a one-to-one preview, this is a task that uses CPU. I mean, we have a 512 there that sits at the very top. Now this task is really not going to swap on the SSD, so we're really seeing very little difference because all of this really comes down to the amount of CPU that you have on the system, however many cores. You can see that 512 is really not having an effect that much at all. In fact, the faster SSD one with a slower SoC is taking slightly longer. What about from the export perspective? Again, the 512 one, this is a task that uses CPU and GPU together. The 512 one that has a slower SSD, that has more cores and more efficient ones are actually running that much faster. And even though they are running that much faster, you can see how the time clustered together, it's only about a few minutes apart. We're not really talking about drastic times variation, even that. And this one, the 512 gigabyte, yes, it is a slower one, but it's only a few seconds behind this machine that has a much faster SSD. And what this really comes down to, the variation between these two, 512 one, is just the SoC. Less CPU, less GPU core. All right, so now let's take a look at a Panorama Merge. This is a 314 megapixel DNG file in the end, and during this process, Lightroom Classic is definitely using much more RAM than what is available on the 16 gigabyte machine. Also remember that the 16 gigabyte is not just available to Lightroom Classic only or the apps you're running. The operating system is still using RAM live in real time, and the program that you're running, for example, Lightroom Classic or whatever other program you have, are also subdividing that memory too. And with this in mind, the 1 terabyte one that has double the speed is performing just about the same as the 512 gigabyte model. So yeah, even though this is really using the SSD for swap, we're really not seeing that big of an effect with regards to SSD speed. Now, if you want to really improve the performance of the machine, just look at the clustering: 16, 32, and 64 gigabytes. You want to get the best performance out of this? Upgrade the memory first on your system. All right, what about Lightroom Cloud version? This is version 6.1. Taking a look at this, all this task uses CPU, GPU, and RAM all together. And yes, this is a single app test, but we can see that, yeah, the 512 is performing just about the same as the one with the double SSDs, only a few seconds apart. And this may be just about a minute faster at the very most on a slightly slower SSD. What you're really going to see is, again, the clustering. More memory, 32 and above, tend to perform much better than the one with less. And this is pretty much regardless of anything else. This is similar amount of cores as you're going to see right now on the CPU and GPU on some of these machines. But you see that if you give it more memory and if the program can use it, it's definitely going to speed things up. Now let's take a look at CaptureOne 23 version 16.0.2. So for this task, rendering preview is a CPU-based task in CaptureOne, and it doesn't really spill into the swap on the SSD, and it barely uses the CPU resource on the system anyway. We can see that the 512 is clustering in both places, so it's really not that big of a difference. And the time variation, we're only talking about minutes and sometimes just only seconds apart. What about on the export using GPU hardware acceleration? For this, interestingly enough, the 512 one with the slower SSD is beating out the one with the faster SSD from the previous gen chip. Obviously, what's happening right now is GPU export. It's not really using that much memory, so it doesn't really go into swapping on the SSD. So again, not so much of an effect or variation. Now let's take a look at Photoshop. This is where we're going to have fun. I'm using Digital Lloyd chamber test, and 2 of his tests I'll run is the medium and the huge. All right, as a reminder, the 512 gigabyte one are the one that runs at half the speed of the higher capacity SSD on the system. Let's take a look at Photoshop Medium. This is a fairly large 15.7 gigabyte file. To put this in context, even if you, for instance, have a 60 megapixel RAW file from a camera, you expand that out into either a TIFF or a PSD, it doesn't really quite reach that file size. This file has a lot more going on for it, has many layers, adjustment, and everything else that cause it to go this large. And by all means, majority of us are not even going to work with a file this large. But if you do, this will give you a good context as far as how much the slowdown is on the one with the slower SSD. So obviously, the first thing is that we can see the cluster for the machines that has more memory on the system, 32 and 64. Yes, there is some time variation. However, we're talking about milliseconds, and that is, for the most part, not noticeable by human beings. But we're going to focus on these 3. That has SSD speed variation. So with this in mind, this is the task that uses RAM first and CPU second. Another thing I also want to point out is that this 15.7 gigabyte file is for the majority filling up the 16 gigabyte memory on these machine arrays. So yes, it definitely have to do a swap on the SSD itself. And with Photoshop, there is a direct swap, so it doesn't go through the system paging or anything like that. It just goes into the SSD right away when there's not enough room, and you can set that up as what they call a scratch disk. Now, with that in mind, I also want to share with you that the 16 gigabyte, again, it's not just being used by Photoshop, it's also being shared with the operating system itself and everything else running on the system. So you're not really getting the full 16 gigabyte. But here's the thing, slower SSD 512, we're only talking about maybe a second apart, a little bit over a second. And this is one of those, I would say, moderate to slightly extreme use case. On a even slower SSD with less core in the system, I mean, we're talking about time variation that are not noticeable by human. So these are factors we need to think about when we're approaching this. Does SSD slowdown show some effect here? Yes, but very minimally. We're only talking about a second. This is not really a big deal at all. All right, now let's talk about a Photoshop huge 56 gigabyte file. Not every one of us is definitely going to be working with this large file, and very few of us do. And if you are, chances are I hope that you already upgrade your machine to more memory and a larger SSD to start out with, because this is an extremely large file. We can see that machines with more memory are doing much better. In fact, doubling the amount of memory, going from 32 to 64, you're cutting the time by a little bit more than half. That's fantastic. But now let's take a look at the cluster on the bottom with 16 gigabytes of memory. The 1 terabyte one with the faster SSD that runs at double the speed is definitely helping a lot, but we're only talking about a minute and 7 seconds variation to the one with the slower SSD. So here's the thing. If this is not something you do on a daily basis, but you happen to buy a stock machine because that is the one that best fits your need, and you may have to do this every so often or just once in a long while, it's only about a minute and 7 seconds longer. Even in this extreme use case, it is still not that big of a deal. So this is the reason why I say configure it to what you need capacity-wise and not so much the speed, because yes, it does make a variation, but if you want to get the best performance, I mean, take a look at it this way. Going from 16 to 32 gigabytes, you're cutting the time by a little bit more than half. And as you go from 32 to 64, you're cutting even more than that. Let's take a look at some of the variation. So this amounts itself to around 32% faster by going to a higher capacity, faster SSD. But if you upgrade just the memory in general, you're really talking about a 51% faster when we compare these two together. Now, this number is going to be a drastic difference as well if we really compare them, but I'm not going to do that. But we're talking about like 60-70% time variation. And when we compare upgrading 32 to 64, we're talking about a 56% speed improvement. So these are just some of the variables to really think about. And this really gives us a good idea as far as how you may want to configure your machine. All right, now let's take a look at Final Cut. This is encoder decoder engine, and I've put in this result. So here's the thing. If you work with video, definitely go with just either the Max or the Ultra. It cuts the time in half, but SSD speed doesn't really play a role as much on these tasks in Final Cut Pro or video work, just because when the program is really rendering these tasks and everything, it just dips down into encoder decoder engine. So regardless of SSD, you're going to be fine. And majority of the times, even working on 4K video like I do, the speed that it requires to stay and read and write on a system is usually around 150 megabytes per second to 200. It's really doesn't even come anywhere close to, for example, the 3 gigabytes per second or anything like that. So here's the thing. Most of the apps that we have right now does not know how to go in and utilize the faster throughput on these SSDs. On a day-to-day usage, you're not going to notice a difference. On the swap, a little bit, but you saw that already in Photoshop, for example, the medium and the large, that the time variations are in seconds or maybe just a minute at the very most. So here's the thing. If you want to figure out the best path to upgrade your system, here's the priority I'll share with you. And this is the one that's going to give you the best performance per the amount of money you're going to spend. First, it's going to be the memory. Second one's going to be the SSD. And third, I would say, is the SoC. Now, second and third, you can definitely swap them around, definitely depending on what you need and what you feel is more important. But if we take a look at this right now, true, memory is going to give you the best bang for the buck, but going to 32 gigabytes of memory is $400. But I still feel you're going to get much more out of this. You saw the time improvement in Photoshop. If you run multitasking, I mean, it's going to be a huge improvement, but just in that singular task, working on the large files, we're saving more than 50% of time when we're really doing that, comparing the two together. Now, you can also certainly go in and choose to upgrade to 1 terabyte SSD, which is half the cost, but you're going to get more bang out of the buck by upgrading to 32 gigabytes of memory. And this is the reason why I say we should probably put the SoC last, because you're really paying $300 to upgrade, for example, the base M2 Pro. You're getting 2 more CPU cores and 3 more GPU cores. You're going to see some variation, and if you need the top performance, I mean, there's the reason why that scaling exists. But if you really want to get the most performance out of your machine, I always argue, go with more memory, you're going to get the best out of it. So, how should you configure your SSD? I hope that this video guides your decision a little bit, that you should really consider SSDs from the standpoint of capacity and not so much speed. Think about how much you're going to use now, how much you need now, and what you may need in the future. And I would just configure it based on that. I wouldn't spend a lot of money on the SSD because, as you saw in the previous chart right there, I mean, as you start to go to a higher capacity, the price starts to jump by quite a bit. So those are just things to think about. Now, personally for me, I feel that for majority of the creative, if you can stretch it, upgrade the memory on the machine and upgrade the SSD to 1 terabyte, that is definitely going to be the sweet spot because you're going to get more speed that's already resulting from giving the machine and the app more memory. And if it should swap to the SSD, you also have a higher speed as well. But I know that many of us don't have the opportunity, and we have to really think about which component we're going to upgrade to get the most performance, because even though we may spend a few extra $100, that is something that we have to stretch. And that's the reason why I'm making this video, to clarify all this up, to help all of you out there. And as always, I believe in a point of diminishing return. I feel that the 1 and 2 terabyte is probably just about the max, at least for me anyway. Now, let me put it this way. If you have the means, if you can justify getting a 4 terabyte or 8 terabyte and spending that much amount of money, and that is worth it for your workflow, I mean, if you watched it to the end, thank you so much, but there was not really a lot of reason for you to watch because you know what you need already. But if you're really trying to decide about this or have anxiety about this, well, hopefully this definitely helps you out and help clear a lot of those anxiety out, that it's not really a big deal. And as I have said in the beginning, context matter and everything is relative. You got to really take a look at it. When someone is saying the SSD is much slower compared to what? Most of the time, they're comparing it to the previous generation machine. But as you have seen in the real-world practical workflow, it doesn't make that much of a variation. And also the other thing, if you're going to get the stock configuration, for example, a 512 gigabyte SSD, always think about working with things logically as well. For example, if you're running multitasking, you're subdividing all the resources, things are definitely going to slow down. So why don't we give the machine all the resources that it needs to just finish the task that much faster, so that the time variation is definitely the smallest one possible. Now, one more thing I want to say about the relativity is that if you're coming from an Intel machine, even getting the M2 Pro with 512 gigabyte SSD as the stock size, you're still going to do just fine, and it's going to be leaps and bounds better than the Intel machine that you currently already own. So everything is all relative, and always remember that and keep these contexts in the back of our mind as we're hearing all these complaints about SSD being slow on these machines, that it doesn't really matter that much. Anyway, I hope you find this content helpful. Remember to be kind in the comment, give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and in art we trust.